Imagine it's 3rd of July 2015. You are a 77-year-old pensioner living in Thessaloniki, Greece. Your name is Georgos Chatzifotiadis, and this morning you leave home with one simple goal: withdraw your wife's €120 pension. That money is supposed to cover medicine, bread, and the electric bill. You have already stood outside 3 banks, moving from one line to the next under the summer heat, watching people clutch plastic folders, ID cards, and receipts that now feel more like prayers than proof. At every door, the answer has been the same: not today. If you have ever wondered why ordinary people can live inside a country for years without seeing the collapse until the exact day it lands on their doorstep, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, and it always leaves the same kind of footprints. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. At the 4th bank, Georgos breaks down in tears, not because Greece collapsed that morning. It did not. The bank lines, the cash limits, the fear, the shame, the feeling that a normal life had suddenly become a negotiation with a machine, all of that was the final frame of a film that had been running for years. That is the collapse timeline nobody explains. Most people imagine collapse as a bomb going off. A single day, a single headline, a single speech from a leader on television. But history shows something colder than that. Collapse is usually a long staircase taken in the dark. At the top, life still feels normal. There are salaries, mortgages, coffee shops, school runs, holiday plans. Then one step gives way, then another. Then the handrail comes off in your hand. By the time people start to panic, the structure has already failed beneath the paint. In Argentina, savers woke up to locked accounts after years of promises that 1 peso was as good as $1. In Weimar Germany, clerks and pensioners watched their money turn to ash, while businessmen with debts and stockpiles raced ahead. In Lebanon, people who had deposited dollars in the bank discovered they did not really own a claim on dollars at all, only on a story that had stopped being true. Different flags, different decades, same shape. A slow build, a denial phase, a policy shock. And then the moment when ordinary people realized they were never standing on stone. They were standing on trust, and trust, once broken, falls faster than brick. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Economic collapse is rarely just about money printing, or debt, or one bad leader, or one foreign shock. Those matter, but beneath them is a simpler mechanism. A country makes promises that only work if confidence stays alive. Banks promise deposits on demand. Governments promise stable money, pensions, wages, and debt payments. Consumers promise to keep spending. Investors promise to keep lending. The whole structure looks solid because everyone is acting as if tomorrow will resemble yesterday. That is the trick. A collapse begins when the promises grow larger than the real engine underneath them. Think of it like a beautiful hotel built over a sinkhole. The lobby is polished, the piano is in tune, the lights are warm. Guests keep checking in, so the manager keeps smiling. But the ground below is hollowing out. No one in the lobby can see it. Then one morning a crack appears in the marble. The problem is not the crack. The problem is the empty space that made the crack possible. In economic history, that empty space usually takes one of 3 forms. Too much debt that cannot be repaid from real income, too many claims on foreign currency that the country does not truly have, or too much money created to cover losses that leaders refuse to admit. Once one of those gaps becomes large enough, the system needs constant fresh trust to stay upright. New deposits, new loans, new buyers of government debt, new people willing to hold the currency. When the fresh trust slows down, the timeline begins. First, officials say the fundamentals are sound. Then they call the first emergency measure temporary. Then they ask the public for patience. Then they protect the system by trapping the public inside it. That is the secret key. Collapse is not the moment the doors lock. Collapse is the period before that, when the leaders know the floor is weak and keep inviting people to dance. This brings us directly to Argentina. For much of the 1990s, Argentina looked like a country that had found a magic trick. After years of inflation, the government tied the peso to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 rate in 1991. 1 peso, $1. Simple, clean, easy to trust. For ordinary people, that peg felt like a bridge out of chaos. Imported goods became affordable. Savings felt safer. Prices stopped racing away. The country looked modern, disciplined, reborn. The bridge was made of borrowed steel. Argentina could keep that promise only if it kept earning or attracting enough dollars. And that became harder with every year. The government carried heavy debts. The economy slowed. By 1998, recession had begun. The country still promised dollar-like stability, but its real ability to support that promise was fading. It was like a household insisting it still had a full pantry because the labels on the jars looked neat, even as the shelves inside were going bare. Now here is where it gets interesting. A fixed exchange rate can create calm, but it can also create theater. It tells people the currency is strong even when the country beneath it is losing strength. The false calm pulls in more trust. People leave savings in banks. Banks hold deposits that can flee overnight. The state borrows more because markets still believe the costume. When the audience finally sees the wires, everyone runs for the exits at once. That is what happened in 2001. Throughout that year, depositors pulled money from Argentine banks. According to a Yale financial crisis case study, by November, peso deposits had declined by more than 1/3 and dollar deposits had fallen by 1/10. On November 28th, the run accelerated. In just 2 days, deposits fell by $3.6 billion. On December 1st, 2001, the government imposed the corralito, a corral around the public. Withdrawals were limited to 250 pesos, or $250 per week per account holder. That number matters because it shows how collapse really works. At first, the money is still said to be yours. You just cannot reach it. The legal title remains in your name while the practical control moves elsewhere. A bank account becomes like a photograph of water to a thirsty person. You can point to it, you can describe it, you can even say it belongs to you, but you cannot drink it. For ordinary Argentines, daily life changed fast. People banged pots and pans in the streets and the cacerolazos. Shops struggled. Families cut back on food and medicine. The World Bank later reported that poverty rose from 28% in 1998 to 37% by October 2001, then surged to 58% by October 2002. Unemployment rose from 13% in 1998 to 18% by October 2001, peaked at 22% in May 2002, and stayed crushingly high. Many middle-class families fell into poverty for the first time. The report called them the new poor. These were not people who thought of themselves as fragile. They had educations, routines, furniture, school plans, and bank assets. Then wages fell, savings were frozen, and they began selling belongings, trading services, and opening tiny home businesses just to survive. The middle class was not hit by a wave from the sea. It was pulled under by the draining of the room itself. Look at what happened next. President Fernando de la Rua resigned amid riots on December 20th. A bank holiday followed. On December 23rd, interim President Adolfo Rodriguez Sá declared a default on $141 billion of foreign debt, one of the largest sovereign defaults in history at the time. On January 6, 2002, Congress ended the convertibility regime. The peso was devalued. What had looked like a stable wall turned out to be a painted curtain. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The same policy that once made people feel safe made them less prepared for the shock. The longer the promise lasted, the more ordinary life wrapped itself around it. Mortgages, savings habits, imported prices, business contracts, retirement plans. So when the promise broke, it did not just change exchange rates, it shattered time. People who had planned a month ahead were suddenly planning the next meal. People who thought in years were thinking in hours. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When a government says your money is safe, what does that really mean if the safety depends on confidence that can vanish in a weekend? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. If Argentina shows how a fixed promise can trap the public, Weimar Germany shows what happens when a state tries to outrun reality by printing its way across the gap. In 1914, Germany left the gold standard, expecting the war to be short. It financed huge costs through borrowing. After defeat in World War I, the burden grew heavier. The Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations. Trade was weak. Capital fled. Budget deficits remained. Instead of fully confronting the losses, the government kept issuing more money. This is often described in abstract language, but the basic picture is simple. The state had bills it could not honestly cover, and it used the printing press like a man using wallpaper to cover a widening hole in the wall. For a while, the wallpaper held. Then the wall itself started to move. By 1922, the mark was already falling hard. Britannica notes that the exchange rate went from 162 marks to the dollar to more than 7,000 in that year alone. By July 1922, prices had risen by some 700%. Then came 1923, the year the whole machine tore loose. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, after disputes over reparation deliveries. The German government responded with passive resistance. Workers were told not to cooperate. Production was disrupted. The state still needed to pay wages and support resistance, so it printed even more. That choice matters. When output falls and money rises, prices do not just climb, they detach. It is like trying to fill a bucket while smashing holes in the bottom and then pouring faster to prove the bucket is fine. The numbers became unreal. According to Britannica, the mark fell to 160,000 to the dollar on July 1st, 1923. By October 1st, it was 242,000 to the dollar. By November 20th, it was 400,000 to the dollar. A trillion mark exchange rate is not just inflation. It is the death of measurement. Money stops being a ruler. A ruler that changes length every hour cannot measure anything. That is why hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money loses value faster than people can spend it, destroys more than buying power. It destroys calculation. It destroys planning. It destroys trust between today and tomorrow. Ordinary Germans lived this in humiliating detail. Britannica describes million-mark notes, then billion-mark notes. One student recalled ordering a cup of coffee for 5,000 marks and a second for 7,000 marks before finishing the first. Shopkeepers could not restock fast enough. Farmers held back produce rather than accept worthless money. Food riots broke out. Commercial dealings slid into barter. Pensioners starved. Middle-class savings were wiped out. Children played with stacks of notes because the paper had begun to matter more than the amount printed on it. This was not a market correction. It was a social acid. It burned through the habits that make a society feel civilized. But here is the part many people miss. Not everyone lost equally. Britannica notes that many businessmen and industrialists made large profits. How? Because inflation punishes those holding cash and fixed incomes, but it can reward those holding real goods, productive assets, and debts that shrink in real value. If you owed money in marks, the value of that debt could melt faster than ice on a stove. If you owned inventory, land, or factories, the nominal price of your assets could keep rising with the storm. In other words, savers stood still while debtors and owners of real things sometimes floated upward. That feels unfair because it is unfair. Collapse is not a clean storm that wets everyone evenly. It is more like a river changing course through a town. One street becomes mud, another becomes waterfront property. By late November 1923, the government introduced a new currency and tighter discipline. The panic eventually ended, but the social scar did not. Millions had learned that a lifetime of caution could be erased faster than a gambler's debt. And once a population learns that lesson, politics changes. People start listening to voices they would have rejected in calmer times. This leads to the second part of this story, and it is closer to our own time than many people like to admit. Lebanon did not collapse because one morning everyone forgot how banking works. Lebanon collapsed because, for years, the financial system was asked to perform a miracle it could only perform as long as new dollars kept arriving. The country imported heavily. The state borrowed heavily. Banks offered attractive returns to pull in deposits, especially in dollars. Those deposits were then funneled into a state and central bank structure that depended on constant inflows. It looked sophisticated. In reality, it was a water wheel, turning only because fresh water kept being poured from above. Once the inflow slowed, the wheel did not slow gently. It seized. The World Bank later called Lebanon's depression one of the world's worst since the mid-19th century. Its own report said real GDP fell from about $52 billion in 2019 to a projected $21.8 billion in 2021, a contraction of 58.1%. Reuters reported that the Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value, and in some accounts, around 95%. By 2021, Reuters said around 78% of the population had fallen into poverty. By 2022, another Reuters report cited about 80% classed as poor. Food prices jumped by 557% from October 2019, according to the World Food Program figures cited by Reuters. These are not just bad statistics. They are measurements of daily narrowing. A taxi ride that once cost £2,000 cost $50,000. A soldier's monthly wage that had once been worth about $900 fell to less than $50. Hospitals struggled. Fuel shortages crippled bakeries, homes, and clinics. Doctors left. Nurses left. Young people looked at the country like passengers studying the last lifeboat. Now observe the mechanism. A banking system can survive weak assets for a while if people leave deposits in place. A government can survive weak finances for a while if banks keep buying its debt. A central bank can survive thin reserves for a while if depositors do not all demand hard currency at once. Lebanon depended on all three whiles. That is how late-stage systems speak. For a time, everyone pretends the future will arrive before the bill does. Then October 2019 came. Banks imposed informal capital controls. That phrase sounds technical, but it means something brutally simple. The banks decided people could not freely access their own money. And because these controls were not properly formalized by law, they often felt arbitrary. The account balance still sat on the screen, but withdrawals were limited, delayed, or converted into local currency at exchange rates that destroyed value. Reuters reported that for some depositors, these withdrawals erased up to 95% of the value. So the public learned a lesson older than paper money. A number in an account is not the same thing as usable wealth. A map is not the land. This is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. On September 14th, 2022, Salih Hafiz, a 28-year-old Lebanese woman, entered a Beirut bank with a fake pistol and retrieved nearly $12,000 of her family's own savings. According to Reuters, she said the money was needed for her sister's cancer treatment. Weeks earlier, Bassam al-Sheikh Hussein, a 42-year-old depositor, held up another Beirut bank to secure $35,000 from a deposit of more than $200,000, also for medical bills. Crowds outside supported him. Think about how far down the timeline a country has to travel before citizens are praised for using force to access their own savings. By that point, the collapse is no longer financial only. It has become moral. The public no longer believes the rules describe justice. It sees the rules as a fence around a shrinking field. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. Argentina, Weimar Germany, Lebanon. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades. Result. At first, there's a normal world, a currency peg that feels solid, a saving system that looks modern, a bank account that appears liquid, a state that says it can manage its debts. Then comes the hidden mismatch. In Argentina, the promise of dollar stability became larger than the country's real dollar strength. In Weimar Germany, state obligations outran productive capacity and honest finance. In Lebanon, the banking system promised access to dollars that depended on a constant stream of new dollars. The mismatch is the rot in the beams. You cannot see it from the street. Then comes denial. Officials reassure, stay open. The language becomes strangely calm, temporary, manageable, exceptional, short-term. These words are not random. They are sandbags placed in front of a rising river. Sometimes they slow the panic. They do not stop the water. Then comes the transfer. This is the stage most people miss. When a system cannot honor all promises, it must decide who absorbs the loss. And history shows that the loss is rarely taken first by the people who designed the system. It is pushed downward. To savers whose cash is trapped, to workers whose wages lag prices, to pensioners whose income is fixed, to small business owners who need daily access to money, not monthly explanations. The timeline is not mysterious once you see this. A long period of comfort financed by something fragile, a growing dependence on fresh trust, a trigger, a denial phase, emergency controls, a social rupture. Then a new story is built over the ruins and introduced as stability. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Collapse is not a single event because the real event is the revelation. It is the moment the public learns what kind of promise it was living inside. Before that revelation, a bank balance feels like money. After it, a bank balance is only a claim on an institution under stress. Before that revelation, a wage feels like security. After it, a wage is just a number racing prices to the finish line. Before that revelation, the state looks like a shield. After it, the shield looks like a mirror reflecting your fear back at you. And this is why the timeline matters. If people are taught to think collapse begins with panic, they will miss the years that make panic inevitable. If they think it starts with empty ATMs, they will ignore the debt, the hidden losses, the false pegs, the disappearing reserves, and the quiet outflow of trust. The line at the bank is only the final chapter. The authors were working much earlier. And this is where history gets personal. Who suffers most when collapse reaches the street? Not usually the people with teams of lawyers, foreign accounts, export income, or political access. The hardest hit are often the people who followed the rules most faithfully. The savers, the pensioners, the salary earners, the small business owners who kept cash in the bank because they were told that was what responsible adults do. Look at Cyprus in 2013. When the country's banking crisis reached its breaking point, the rescue did not come as a clean gift from outside. It came with a bail-in, which means losses were forced onto creditors and large depositors rather than covered fully by taxpayers. Reuters reported that 47.5% of deposits above 100,000 euros at Bank of Cyprus were converted into equity. Deposits below 100,000 euros were protected. That threshold sounds like a line between the safe and the rich. But in real life, it was often a line between the protected and the trapped. Small firms can keep payroll money above that level. Families may have house sale proceeds sitting in an account above that level. A number that looks large on television can be ordinary working capital in a real business. The haircut was not just a financial event. It was a lesson in hierarchy. When systems crack, some claims are treated as sacred and others as negotiable. Now look at Greece again. On June 29, 2015, banks shut and capital controls began. Cash withdrawals were limited to 60 euros per day per card. What does 60 euros a day mean to a tourist headline reader? Not much. What does it mean to an old person buying medicine for a spouse, or a family trying to pay rent, or a cafe owner needing small change, fresh milk, and deliveries? It means daily life shrinks to the diameter of an ATM slot. According to the Yale Crisis case study, the bank holiday was first meant to last until July 6th, but banks did not reopen until July 20th. Capital controls were only fully lifted in 2019. So even when the acute panic faded, the country kept living inside its shadow. This is what ordinary people live through. Not just one dramatic day, but months and years of compression. Savings lose freedom. Paychecks lose power. Professional dignity erodes. Time gets spent in queues, paperwork, price comparisons, and anxious phone calls. The mental burden is huge. The World Bank's report on Argentina described stress, depression, family strain, violence, addiction, and rising despair. Lebanon saw migration surge, hospitals cut back, and public services grind down. Weimar saw food riots and the collapse of ordinary trust. These are economic stories only if we use the word economic too narrowly. Really, they are stories about human bandwidth. Collapse consumes attention first, then money, then relationships. It turns a family kitchen table into a crisis desk. It turns caution into regret. It turns citizens into full-time managers of scarcity. And this is where the deepest unfairness appears. The people most exposed are often the people least able to negotiate with institutions. A pensioner cannot hedge like a bank. A shop owner cannot wait 6 months for a committee. A nurse cannot invoice in dollars just because the local currency is failing. When prices leap or withdrawals freeze, the salaried middle gets squeezed like a bridge caught between two moving cliffs. Their costs jump now. Their income adjusts later, if it adjusts at all. In Argentina, that meant middle-class families selling household goods and slipping into the informal economy. In Greece, it meant pensioners lining up before dawn because cash itself had become ration time. In Lebanon, it meant professionals with education, careers, and years of savings finding themselves unable to pay for medical care without pleading with their own bank. Even the protected categories are not always truly protected. Cyprus shielded deposits up to 100,000 euros, but payroll accounts, house sale proceeds, and business cash above that line still took the hit. A rule designed on a spreadsheet can land on real life like a falling beam. That is the metaphor worth holding on to. In every collapse, the official language stays tidy long after daily life stops being tidy. Policymakers talk about liquidity, recapitalization, restructuring, and temporary controls. Families talk about rent on Friday, medicine on Tuesday, tuition next month, and whether there's enough fuel to get to work tomorrow. One side speaks in frameworks, the other speaks in groceries. That gap is where trust dies, and yet some people come through these periods less damaged than others. Not untouched, not unscarred, but less damaged. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared 3 characteristics. First, they understood the difference between a promise and an asset. That sounds abstract, so let me make it plain. A bank deposit, a pension promise, or a fixed exchange rate may look solid in good times. But in a crisis, those are claims on institutions. They're only as strong as the institutions behind them. People who survived better tended to ask a harder question early. What is this claim actually backed by? In Weimar Germany, holders of cash and fixed pensions were devastated, while many who owned productive assets, inventory, or land held up better. In Argentina, those with income linked to exports or dollars outside the trapped banking system often had more room to breathe than wage earners paid in weakening pesos. In Lebanon, families with remittances from abroad, meaning money sent by relatives in other countries, often endured differently from families fully trapped inside the domestic banking maze. Second, survivors tended to avoid the fatal mismatch. They did not owe in the hard thing while earning in the weak thing. That line matters. History is full of people ruined not only by falling income, but by the wrong kind of debt. A debt in foreign currency can become a guillotine if your income arrives in a collapsing local currency. By contrast, in inflationary episodes, some local currency debtors saw the real burden of their debts shrink. The winners were not magical. They were simply standing on a different side of the balance sheet. Third, they kept flexibility. Flexibility of income, flexibility of location, flexibility of skills, flexibility of trust. When systems jam, flexible people can barter, relocate, switch markets, lean on networks, or earn in different ways. The rigid break first. The deeply specialized salary earner with all savings in one domestic institution can become more fragile than the shopkeeper with stock, cousins abroad, and 10 ways to improvise. That may sound unfair. Again, it is unfair. But history is not a fairness machine. It is a weather record. And the weather record shows that when the money system freezes, adaptability becomes a form of heat. This is not financial advice. It is pattern recognition. The people who came through collapse best were usually not the people who trusted the official story the longest, They were the people who recognized, sometimes quietly and early, that stability built on denial is like ice over moving water. It looks solid until too many feet stand on it at once. So return for a moment to Giorgos Chatzifotiadis in Thessaloniki, a 77-year-old man standing outside a bank trying to withdraw 120 euros for his wife. His tears became a symbol because people recognized something in them, not just pain, recognition, the understanding that a nation's crisis had finally entered the smallest room in the house, the kitchen, the medicine drawer, the envelope of bills. Giorgos was not looking at a sudden disaster. He was standing at the end of a timeline. Years of debt, weak growth, political bargaining, dependence on outside funding, and delayed choices had narrowed into one old man at one locked system. That is how collapse usually arrives, not as thunder from a clear sky, as weather you were told not to notice until it soaked through the roof. The lesson from Argentina, Weimar Germany, Lebanon, Cyprus, and Greece is not that every country is the same. They are not. The lesson is that the sequence of damage is often more similar than people think. Promises expand. Reality weakens. Officials delay. Losses search for a host. And ordinary people discover too late that they were standing closest to the edge. If you understand that timeline, you stop being hypnotized by the final headline. You start asking earlier questions. What is this stability built on? Who absorbs the loss if the promise fails? And why are emergency measures always described as temporary right before they become normal? This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.